How are you seeing the situation currently, and is there a massive drop and a massive hit that the agri sector is bound to take?
Well, I think before I answer that, we'll have to look at the key differences vis-a-vis last year. Let me point out that this time around, this largely is a known unknown. And we have some experiential learnings from last year. Last year, it was a pure supply shock. This time, it might morph into some sort of a demand problem. And we need to recognize that the design of lockdowns is very, very different. This time around, we may see differential peaks and troughs. Each state is doing these restrictions in its own way. And let me also point out that the commercial activities are being allowed by certain states. So, for example, we see certain states allowing construction, sand mining, etc. So, I think this time around, while it is still very early to come up with any of these, demand side analysis, I think the situation is very fluid, and I do recognize that there are downside risks. And also, let me point out an important caveat. It could take years to gauge the different dimensions of the cost imposed by the pandemic, especially given that it is impacting lives more than livelihoods this time on the rural side. And we don't really count the informal sector very well. So I think that is something that I want to highlight. Second, the growth rate may come off on the rural side, but growth will continue. Remember, growth rate last year was way higher than normal. So we are talking about an enlarged base, and growth on top of that is not going to be insignificant. So I think with those caveats out, let me point out that if I look at rural in two distinct, with divisions, agri and non-agri. Agri is clearly going to be a silver lining. It is going to be a savior. Farm or agricultural activity-based cash flows are actually doing well. It is the non-agri based or the rural economic activity-based cash flows that might be impacted. When I talk about agriculture, if I look at the conversion of produce into cash, procurement of Rabi crops started in April. And we've seen the marketing season for Rabi really get off well. More than a third of wheat production is procured, etc. 60% of paddy, etc. has been procured. So the conversion of produce into cash has not been disrupted. Plus, the government has also started to put money directly into farmers' pockets using the DBT, the PM Kisan, etc. And therefore, the lockdowns have not really hit the peak agri economic activity. Therefore, I think it's not going to be impacting the agri incomes. And agri terms of trade have been very, very good, right? Despite COVID, this has actually done very well. And India has also managed to capture some new markets we've seen when it comes to exports. So I think the ability to spend based on agri cash flows is going to be intact. I don't really see a major problem with that. I think the problem could be with willingness. So there are positives like the third consecutive monsoon. Agri GVA could be growing at a steady pace for the 7th year in a row. And the government might spend, and please remember, government spend has a higher multiplier effect on rural incomes. But loss of lives can impact the willingness to spend. Off-pocket medical expenses are going to be anywhere in the ballpark range of 50,000 to 1 lakh crore based on various surveys. So there could be fear, there could be a sentiment impact, and people could get into that precautionary savings mode. And also the non-farm cash flows or the economic activity-based incomes will get impacted because retail and commercial activities have been impacted on the rural side. So I think we have to make a distinction between agri and non-agri when we look at rural.
Right. Mr. Hussain, if I could get you into the conversation as well, given that the agri sector contributes to around 20% to the total GDP and the impact that the second wave is also having on, the rural parts of the country, that coupled with unseasonal rains this time around, what kind of an impact do you think it's going to have on the agri output?
I think the agricultural sector is also going to be badly impacted this year. And the reason is that last year, somehow the mandis were operating even during the lockdown. This year, I find that in most of the states, the mandi operations are closed, and except for wheat procurement, which is done primarily by the government, we do not know whether the farmers have sold off their chana crop or what happened to their masoor crop, etc. The feedback I am getting from various sources is that farmers have still not sold their entire chana and masoor production. Also, we know that in case of fresh produce like vegetables, etc., farmers are not able to realize a fair price. And therefore, I agree with Mr. Shukla that the rural sector is going to be impacted. Moreover, a large part of remittances go into rural economy from the cities, from the urban areas, from factories, and they are also going to be very adversely impacted.
Mr. Shukla, I was reading a report from one of your peers, which is the Economist from SBI, and he's making a case that in this year Indians will have to spend 70,000 crore only on medical expenditure. Now, let's put that in perspective, what it means for the rural savings and rural spend. While the inflation will ensure that the agrarian economy is taken care of, but on the spending front, healthcare expenditure for a rural population is something which is not a productive expenditure. It is a compulsive and an expenditure which is not going to create value.
So I think I mentioned the out-of-pocket expenses, which could be anywhere between 50,000 crore to 1 lakh crore. There is definitely going to be an impact. And like I said, we'll have to see whether it manifests into a larger demand shock because of the fear or the sentiment issue. And will it lead to people dipping into their savings further? But let me point out one key difference. Last 3 years in a row, the agri sector, when it comes to agricultural output and in terms of trade, I think people have enough, cash balances. This part of the economy was not as badly hit last year. So I think going forward, we will have to see how much it impacts the consumption cycle on the rural part, and if they get into that precautionary savings mode going forward. But now let me come to the aggregate demand picture. I think what has happened is last year rural was the same. Like I said, it was agriculture which held up, and agriculture, I believe this year as well is going to be a silver lining. But the non-agri part on rural is going to be impacted. But talking about the aggregate demand picture, the demand side could pick up on the urban areas, especially the ones that got hit early in the cycle. I'm talking about the likes of Mumbai, Maharashtra, Delhi, etc. These could drive aggregate consumption back. So when I talk about aggregates, the impact could actually move from rural to urban. Urban can be a driver. But yes, there could definitely be some impact on non-agri consumption and non-agri incomes. As I said, this is a sector or segment that we don't really count very well. You know, the way the CSO actually looks at GDP numbers or the data is collated. It could be quite some time before we really get to know what is the real cost imposed by the pandemic. It might take several quarters. So what you will see, Nikunj, is the stated data, the formal sector data, will continue to give you a picture which may not really reflect the kind of pain which should ideally be reflecting given the loss of lives and the kind of rapid spread that we have seen on the rural side this time. So I'm making a distinction between the formal data that you'll continue to get and the real pain on the informal side, which may take quite some time to manifest in data.
Mr. Hussain, when and where do you exactly see the non-agrarian part of the rural economy start impacting the rural picture or the rural aggregate demand. We can look at the agrarian economy, like both of you have argued and expressed your thoughts that is doing okay, that is doing fine. But the non-agrarian part in rural India is also becoming very large. Gone are those days that we always used to think that rural India means agriculture and nothing else.
Right, so Nicole, sorry. Okay, this was for Mr. Hussain. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yes. So right now, because of the fear and lockdown in most of the states, the other sectors of economy, especially rural areas, have also come to almost, they've stalled. So construction is stalled, and I suspect that rural industries would also not be working because the virus is now into very deep pockets of the country which were not hit last year. So I think the non-agri part of rural economy is also going to be very badly impacted. And it depends how soon we can vaccinate the people. See, the road ahead lies in vaccination. The data which we have so far about the number of vaccines which can be produced by the two companies and the data which is coming of the expected number of doses August to December, there is absolute mismatch, and there is no confirmation whether these estimates of August to December are going to come true. So if we can ramp up vaccinations, the economic activity can come back in rural areas, which will add to the demand. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just also understand, Mr. Hussain, if we can get a sense of the kind of impact on supply. Farmers have been suffering as well. So will we see that impact, the kind of food grain supply that we see? Also the kharif crop sowing, for example, some of these pockets when it comes to the agri industry right now. What is the kind of impact that we can actually see on crops and supply going forward?
My assessment is that sowing will not be impacted too much. The monsoon is still some time away in North India, where a lot of rice is grown in kharif crop. We still have about a month, more than a month. So if the spread is contained, I do not think the sowing will be very badly affected. In any case, as we know, there is a lot more manpower available in rural areas than is actually needed. And this time, I think the out migration has not been as large as last year. So I do not think the sowing itself will be affected. However, the availability of certain seeds may be impacted, the availability of certain pesticides, etc., may be impacted. But I do not see any serious impact on supply of food grains in the open market because the government has a lot of stock and it is able to move that stock quite efficiently from the surplus states to deficit states. So I do not see much impact of domestic reasons on prices. However, there are global reasons for oilseeds and pulses.
Okay. And Mr. Shukla, in terms of the impact on exports as well, do you see that as a segment that will continue to grow going forward?
Absolutely. I think that is one area where we are seeing a significant traction. We have seen Indian agri exports really do well. And we've entered some new markets for some of these agricultural produce that we have. And I think looking at the prices, and if you recall, agricultural activities basically mirror or reflect the cobweb model, right? So if you see higher prices ahead of you, the supply side gears up towards that. We are seeing globally, I mean, any commodity, soft or hard, at close to say 10-year or a decade high currently. And based on that, we have seen agricultural exports do well, not only from India, but globally. And I think the redeeming factor is that we have been able to enter some newer markets where our agri exports were not going in before this. So, for example, Brazil, Chile, Puerto Rico, some of these countries, we've been able to make some headway, and India has been able to capture newer markets as well. And I think this trend is likely to continue. We might also continue to export higher amounts of wheat, non-basmati rices, etc.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Great chatting with you this morning, and good to get a sense of some of the factors at play currently in the agri segment.